Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today's episode in part examines the implications of being governed by the very old. In 2018, Malaysian politics was graced with the return to power of 93-year-old Mahathir Mohamad, who had previously served as Prime Minister between 1981 and 2003. Ethnic tensions are intrinsic to Malaysian history and politics. A mix between Malays, Chinese and Indians, the majority ethnic Malay population, reeling after years of partly real and partly perceived suppression by the other groups, rallied around Mahathir in the 1980s, who promised to construct a country run by and for Malays. This had mixed results, but few can dispute Mahathir didn't give it a good go. He served as Prime Minister for 22 years, staying in power by locking in the Malay vote for 5 elections in a row. When Mahathir came back, it was to defeat his hand-picked successors and his old party, a party which, until Mahathir's 2018 victory, had never lost power. There is something very odd that it took a 93-year-old to finally upend Malaysia's ruling party and create something new, especially when that 93-year-old had been the gatekeeper of the old political system his entire adult life. My guest today is James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. James has written extensively on Malaysian politics, and his outlook for Malaysia's future is mixed. Whilst he is encouraged by the increasing pluralism at the top of Malaysian politics since 2018, he is also concerned by the pervasive influence of Islamism. We discuss these issues, as well as the implications of having a country so defined by ethnic division. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Mahathir Mohamad. Hi James, how are you?
Good morning.
James, we are talking about Mahathir Mohamad today. He was Prime Minister of Malaysia from 1981 until 2003, and then again for a second time between 2018 and 2020. The histories of Malaysia and Singapore are sort of inextricably linked. I did a podcast about 6 months ago with PJ Tung about Lee Kuan Yew, the long-standing Prime Minister of Singapore. I think there are some similarities between Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew as characters and as political figures, and perhaps differences, and it's some of the differences I'd like to perhaps tease out today. But something that came out again and again from my conversation with PJ as being consequential about Singapore was the role of ethnic politics and ethnic divisions. Malaysia has ethnic divisions as well. Can you describe the ethnic breakdown in Malaysia? And also just something I was sort of thinking about when I was preparing for this episode is obviously that Malaysia is 2 islands. So it's interesting to think about how kind of an ethnic construct across 2 different islands, which are quite far away from one another, might actually work in practice.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. To understand Malaysia, I think you need to understand the racial makeup. And in addition to that, you need to understand the geography of Malaysia as well. So the current Federation of Malaysia essentially consists of 3 separate entities. They all got together in 1963. And these 3 entities, the commonalities was that they were all colonies of the UK. So when Britain decided to get out of Southeast Asia, initially they wanted all these 5 entities that they control in Southeast Asia. And these 5 entities were Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, what we call Sabah today, Brunei and Sarawak. They want all these 5 entities to come together into a single new country. You have to understand, back in the 50s and 60s, it was the Cold War era. So obviously you can't allow 5 new countries to appear suddenly, especially in Southeast Asia, where people are very worried about the rise of China and the spread of communism. So initially, the British wanted all these 5 entities to come together to create a federation of Malaysia. So Brunei refused to come on board. Singapore came on board, but 2 years later, because of a fallout with the Malaysian system, they left Malaysia. So the Malaysia you see today just consists of Malaya, or the Malay Peninsula, Sabah and Sarawak, which are located on the island of Borneo. Now, in terms of the racial makeup, the three major races on the peninsula side are the Malays, Indians, and Chinese. And in Sabah and Sarawak, the demography is very, very complicated. There's basically about at least 50 to 60 different tribal groupings. But in Sabah, essentially, the majority tribal groupings is a group called the Kadazan Dusuns. And in Sarawak, the biggest ethnic group are the Ibans. And these groups are indigenous to the island of Borneo. So if you talk about the racial divide in Malaysia today, essentially you're talking about the Malays versus the non-Malays versus the tribal groupings in Sabah and Sarawak. So these are the three big groupings.
If we move to discuss Mahathir, the subject of our conversation today, he was born in Alor Setar in 1925. He's still alive. He's 97 years old now. Briefly, what do you think is important to know about Mahathir's early life and his first dealings in politics in the 1940s and 50s? If you look at this very long, 7-decade career that he's ended up having, what from the sort of first 20 or 30 years of his life is significant to understanding this man?
I think to understand Mahathir's political career, you really have to read his book. He wrote a very interesting book when he was out in power for a little while after 1969 up to 71. The book is called The Malay Dilemma. Everything you need to know about Mahathir, his early upbringing, and his political philosophy can be found in the book. But essentially, Mahathir is very much a creature, somebody who was born in a post-war period, who lived through Second World War, who understood the difficulties of the war years. He lived through the Cold War years, and I think he was very much the nationalist that we find in many parts of the Third World. Immediately after the war, they wanted to move their countries to independence. Now, in terms of his political dealings, my take is that a lot of his political outlook in life was shaped by his experience gathered during the Japanese occupation, and secondly, when he did not get a chance to go to study in the West. So in the old days, before Malaysia became an independent state, all the top Malay students or all the top students of the country were traditionally sent to the UK to study. And you find this a similar pattern in all the British colonies. They got the brightest and the smartest, or members of the royal families, and they send them to the UK in order to get them to appreciate the British system. So in Mahathir's case, he was not able to get a scholarship. So he ended up as a medical student in Singapore in those days. That university in Singapore served the entire British colonies, including Malaya. So he went there as a medical student. And I think the sort of racism he faced in Singapore and his unhappiness with the British system, he felt that the Malays were repressed by the British. I think that colored his entire view of politics or what Malaysia should be like in the future. And I think he carried his set of beliefs formed during that initial period throughout his life, including today.
So this was racism that he experienced as a Malay person?
Yes, this was his experience as a Malay. The story going around was that when he was a medical student in Singapore, on one particular day, he went to see Siti Hasma, his wife. Then both of them were medical students at the University of Singapore then. So when he arrived at Siti Hasma's house in a cab, the cab driver, instead of dropping him off at the front of the house, just drove all the way to the back. So this was the assumption that he was working as a laborer or worker in the house. So he was not entitled to walk through the front door. And I think experiences like that really color his views about ethnicity, about racial relations, and about where the Malay community stood in terms of politics.
His political career is so long, I feel the need to sort of jump in somewhere. And I want to talk first about his relationship with Tunku Abdul Rahman, was seen as the founding father of Malaysia. Who was Tunku, and what was Mahathir's and Tunku's relationship like? What was the nature of it?
So Tunku Abdul Rahman is a member of the Malaysian royalty. So like many parts of the British Empire, being a member of the royalty means that if you are talented, you had a bit of education, the British colonial authorities will send you to the UK to study. So Tunku came to the UK to study. He took a law degree, but an extremely long law degree, because in between he was having fun living in the UK. He was the person known as the founder of the Federation of Malaysia, simply because when he went back, the British supported him politically. He set up the political party. He became the leader of the party called UMNO, and he's the one who negotiated the independence of Malaya and later Malaysia with the British. So, as I said earlier, the British wanted all these important people in the colonies to study in the UK, to influence them, to make sure that they're pro-British, so that when the British leave the country and those countries became independent, they remained friendly to the interests of the UK. So Tunku Abdul Rahman was the founder of Malaysia in that sense, that he negotiated independence. Now, in terms of his relationship with Mahathir, initially Mahathir was a supporter of Tunku. Mahathir, in fact, joined Tunku's party, UMNO. Initially, Tunku did recognize Mahathir's political talent. Everything was quite okay in the initial period, but everything fell apart in 1969. Most people will tell that in 1969, that is the watershed moment for Malaysia, because in 1969, immediately after the general elections, there was racial rioting in Malaysia, in all the major urban centers in the Malay Peninsula. So during this period, there was a lot of political turbulence, and it was during this period that Mahathir wrote an open letter to Tunku Abdul Rahman asking him to step down as the Prime Minister. Now, that's a really, really important event, because this was the first time where a young Malay chap with no political standing stood up within the party and asked the leader of the party, the sitting Prime Minister, to resign. So basically, the letter is quite controversial, because basically the letter argues that Tunku will have to step down as the Prime Minister, because it was Tunku's policy that created the riots. So basically, Mahathir's argument was quite simple. The Federation of Malaysia, or Malaya, belongs to the Malays. The Malays are the indigenous people of Malaysia, and therefore they should they should be ranked number one, first among equals. And his idea was this idea of Ketuanan Melayu, which is Malay supremacy. So he argues that Tunku had gone too far to accommodate the interests of the non-Malays, principally the Chinese and the Indians. And because of that, the bulk of the Malay population were very unhappy, and that led to the riots of 1969. Although initially that idea was not widely accepted in the Malay establishment, but after the riots and the suspension of parliament, I think what happened was that the Malay establishment decided that we need to rebuild Malaysia in such a way that it was made clear that the Malays would dominate not only in the political sphere, but in every aspect of this new nation. So I think after that sort of idea came into the Malay establishment, once it was widely accepted, then that's where Mahathir's idea took off, and Tunku was forced to resign as the Prime Minister. And shortly after that, Mahathir came back into the party. I forgot to mention earlier that Mahathir was suspended from UMNO party because of the letter. But after 1971, he was allowed back into the party when Tunku was forced to step down as the Prime Minister.
One of the interesting things about Malaysia as a system is that if you look at it, at least nominally, on paper, it looks very similar to the British political system. It's got a sort of Westminster parliamentary system. It has a head of state that was described as a monarch. In this era, the 1960s, how democratic could you say that Malaysia actually was in practice? Was there sort of a realistic chance that a party other than UMNO could have won power?
Well, I think what you find in the 1960s, in the first decade of Malaysian independence, is that Malaysia was democratic in the sense that the laws was written in such a way that everyone was more or less equal. The problem then was that they did not manage the ethnic relations very well. So there was a lot of disparity. So it is a fact that in the 1960s, the bulk of the economy was controlled by the foreigners. You have to remember the British were given the height of all the major companies in Malaysia. So even after they left, the companies obviously were still operating in Malaysia. So they still held a lion's share of the big stuff in the economy. Second to the British were the Chinese community. They had a big share of the economy as well. And the Malays had a very, very small share of the economy. I think most economists will agree that the Malay share of the overall economy will probably be around 5% or less. So you can imagine the unhappiness in the Malay community.
And just to put that in context, in terms of percentages of population at this time, can you give a sort of rough idea of what the population share was between the Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians?
Sure. At the time of independence, basically the Chinese and the Indians were hovering around 45%. The Malays was around 49%, just near the 50%, and the other 5% of the population came from Sabah and Sarawak. But today the population has changed completely. Today the Chinese population has fallen to about 24%. The Indian population, which used to hover around 10%, is now roughly only around 6%. So basically the Malay population has gone up tremendously. But that's not how people in Malaysia today look at Malaysia. Today, basically, when they look at the population, they look at it in terms of the Bumiputra versus the non-Bumiputra. So the Bumiputra is an administrative term that was brought in after 1970 to include all the groups that are deemed as indigenous people. So basically, when you count the indigenous population in Malaysia, which includes the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak, the Malay population will jump to approximately 70%.
Rahman resigned in 1970, and this was kind of the signal for Mahathir to come back to politics. You mentioned that obviously they'd fallen out over Mahathir's request that he resigned. How easy did he find it to come back into politics and start climbing the AMNO ladder, such that by the early 1980s he was in a position to become Prime Minister?
So I think he didn't have much of a problem coming back. So in the early 1970s, there was a very small group of Malay professionals, being a medical doctor, obviously helping with his standing in the Malay community. And he was quite a popular doctor in Alor, where he practiced. So I don't think that was the issue. I think the thing was that he was extremely lucky. He was extremely lucky that the prime minister that came after Tunku Abdul Rahman, the one that actually pushed Tunku Abdul Rahman out, was a guy called Tun Razak. But Tun Razak could not really rule properly because by the mid-70s, he was suffering from cancer. So he died and he was replaced by his brother-in-law called Hussein On. Now, when I say Mahathir was lucky, because Hussein On selected him as his deputy. And he actually jumped through several other people who were much more senior than him. And Hussein On was also very sick. So by 1981, when Hussein On had to medically retire, Mahathir was the deputy prime minister then. So obviously he became the prime minister. So in some ways, he was very lucky that the two leaders preceding him both, had to step down, and one died in office due to medical issues. So he was almost at the right place at the right time.
You mentioned earlier Mahathir's political talents. What were those talents?
Well, I think if you speak to people, the older people who served with him or who were with him at the time when he became the prime minister in the 1980s, I think what was very clear about him was that a lot of Malays saw that he was very different from the other Malay political leaders because he had a very clear vision of where he wanted Malaysia to go. He had a very clear vision of how he wanted to reform the Malay community. Here I'm talking about something that he Mahathir himself written extensively. He has made a very powerful argument that one of the issues making the Malays fall back in terms of progress or stopping their progress is that Malays are quite feudalistic. So things like this, he had a very clear program about how to make Malaysia a developed country, and he also was seen as somebody who was widely read, sort of an intellect, and somebody who could had a reputation as ultra Malay nationalist. So the Malays trusted him to make sure that unlike before 1969, he will not give in too much to the Chinese and the Indians. So in that sense, he was quite interesting and interesting in the sense that he did not see himself a Malaysian leader. He always saw himself as a Malay nationalist, and I think that was the key to his success.
Mahathir became prime minister in 1981. You mentioned that he saw himself as a Malay nationalist. In terms of putting that into practice in the 1980s, what did that actually mean? How did he actually want to change the political and social settlement in Malaysia?
So when Mahathir came to power, he was very clear that what he needed to do in terms of making sure that there was progress in the Malay community. If you remember what I said earlier was that at the time of independence, the Malays really were in control of politics and bureaucracy, but the big gap was that they had a very little share in the economy. So one of the things he quickly did when he was prime minister was that he wanted to increase the share of the Malays community in the private economy. The way he did it was basically through an industrialization program. That's number one. He went into a lot of big industries. Secondly, he did a privatization exercise. So in the 1980s, similar to the UK under Thatcher, there was this big move towards privatization. But in the Malaysian case, they added the racial criteria to this privatization, industrialization. In other words, when you privatize government utilities, all these things, a lot of these were given to Malay companies. So immediately the Malay company had a bigger share in the economy, right? Obviously, a lot of these utilities are very big companies when you privatize it. It was the same story with Malaysia industrialization policy. So they did things like a car plant, building cars, set up steel industries, everything. So the ultimate aim of Mahathir was that all this eventually would end up in the hands of Malay capitalists. So he was trying to do two things. He was trying to build a Malay middle class. Secondly, he was trying to make sure that he can build a large, what they call the Bumiputera commercial industrial community. In other words, a Malay capitalist. So he wanted to ensure that, within a very, very short time, the Malay had a substantial stake in the economy so that the Malay were seimbang. They wanted it to balance out with the Chinese and Indians. So the idea was that if the Malays had an equally big stake in the economy like the Chinese and the Indians, then you have political stability because everybody had a stake in the economy.
And in terms of achieving that political stability, I mean, I can sort of see. I don't want to sound like an apologist for sort of chauvinistic policies here because I'm not trying to justify them, but obviously the situation that you described, immediate post-war, where the largest part of the population has very little control within the economy, that's not an optimal situation. Forgetting any policies that came after. Can you describe at all, in terms of the actual results of this policy, can you see it as a success, do you think? Because obviously, in spite of what I just said, selecting economic sort of leaders and captains of industry based on an ethnicity is not a good idea because you're immediately excluding bright people from other ethnic backgrounds who might actually run it better.
Yes, and I think you have really touched the real issue in Malaysia, that this sort of ethnic identity linked to the economy and the wider community, this is the crux of the matter in Malaysia. So today, when you look back at all the Mahathir economic policies, I think you will find that most economists will argue that it's a mixed bag. There are some areas that are successful, some areas are not very successful. So, for example, he was quite successful in building a Malay middle class. But in terms of Malay capitalists, a big group of those who were given opportunities during his time essentially did not survive. After the great financial crisis, a lot of them, did not make it because a lot of those people rely on government support. So when a crunch came, their business could not survive. So the number of Malay capitalists in Malaysia is actually quite small. So in that part, I think most people would say that it's been a failure. In terms of his policy of privatization, most people argue that it's also been a failure. Although he did created huge companies and he did sell it to individual Malays, the bottom line is that a lot of those companies got into trouble and the government was forced to come back to bail them up. So a perfect example of that is that Malaysian Airlines, which used to be a very famous world airline, it was privatized, sold to a Malay capitalist. After the financial crisis, everything fell apart, and the government was forced to come back and bail the airline out. So today, the government is burdened with an airline which is still making losses. So I think you have really, hit the nail on the head and said that the problem with Malaysia is this issue of ethnicity. Race in Malaysia is sort of the starting point for everything that happens in Malaysia. But the other thing that happened during Mahathir's rule, which I think, my opinion is that he's to blame for it, was that during his long tenure as the prime minister, he flirted with this issue of political Islam. He tried to build a solid base of political support, not only based on Malay nationalism, but also based on Islamic supremacy. So he started to bring in Islamic elements into the administration. He started to promote Islam in the political arena. So the end result you have in Malaysia today is not only political supremacy or Malay political supremacy, you also have Islamic supremacy. So with these two toxic elements, this is where the issues become convoluted in Malaysian politics.
So was he trying to sort of conflate the two and say you sort of like you can't be a Malay without being a sort of fervent a Muslim too?
Yes, what he was basically trying to do was that within UMNO itself, UMNO was actually a very powerful Malay political parties when he was in power. The only opposition to UMNO throughout the period he was prime minister was another Malay party which initially broke away from UMNO. It was called PAS, or Parti Islam Malaysia. So from the name alone, you can gather that it's an Islamic party. And their number one aim has always been to set up Islamic State in Malaysia. So he saw that as a threat because towards the end of his rule, it was very clear that PAS was making inroads into the Malay community. Because as you know, Islam is a very powerful political symbol. We saw that there was a worldwide revival of Islamic politics after the fall of Iran in 1979. So throughout Mahathir's period, the Islamic Party was getting more and more powerful. So that's the reason why he wanted to bring in more Islamic elements into UMNO, into government, so he can tell the Malay community, you don't have to support PAS because you wanted more Islam. UMNO as Islamic as PAS. So this is where the problem lies.
In sort of Islamic politics, you have two distinct things. You have sort of Islamism, which people that, or Islamists, are people who kind of want to use the system of government as it stands to kind of turn it in on itself and create a kind of Islamic style of government. And then you have sort of outright jihadists. These are people who are not interested in using government and politics at all for its own ends. They want to sort of completely fundamentally change the system by force, by kind of violent force. Islamism has obviously played an important role in Malaysian politics recently. Is there a big problem with sort of jihadism that we have seen in other parts of the Islamic world over the last couple of decades?
Not really, not in the Malaysian context. But the interesting thing about the way Mahathir has brought Islam into Malaysian or into Malaysian politics is that he sees Islam as a fundamental tool that he used to change the mindset of the Malays. So when he was promoting Islam in Malaysia, he was promoting a very specific set of Islamic beliefs, things like work hard, study hard, new knowledge and everything. So he was trying to use very much, he was trying very hard to use Islam in order to modernize the thinking of the Malays. If you remember what I said earlier, one of the things that he was very worried about the progress of the Malay community was that he felt that the Malay community was too feudalistic. So he thought that if I can use Islam as justification for them to learn, to study hard, to work hard, these people will be successful in a modern capitalistic economy. But the problem is that when he tried to bring that into the administrative part, he basically created a bureaucracy to promote Islam. And what you have is a bureaucratization of Islam in Malaysia. So one of the unusual things about Islam in Malaysia is that it is defined by the state and is imposed by the bureaucracy. So very often, Muslims from other parts of the world, when they come to Malaysia, they find that the way Islam is practiced in Malaysia and Malaysia is a Sunni Islam, they find it a bit unusual because a lot of the rules about the way Islam is practiced in Malaysia stems from the bureaucracy, not from the religious class.
So it's almost like the Church of England then.
Yes, yes, but much more powerful, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that Malaysia has a head of state, but Mahathir was not the head of state, he was the prime minister. The head of state is sort of colloquially referred to as the king. But this is quite an unusual monarchy in the sense that it's at least partly elected. Can you go into how the head of state operates in Malaysia?
Yeah, Malaysia is unique in the world that it is the only country in the world where the head of state, the monarchy, is elected among the 9 sultans. There are 9 sultans in Malaysia. They're called the Conference of Rulers. So among themselves, they'll elect one person to serve as the king for a period of 5 years. The way it works in practice is that usually the oldest member get to serve the 5 years. Obviously, you do not want any sultan to miss out. So that's how the system works in practice. In terms of the constitutional requirements, the head of state is a ceremonial post. So the king is a ceremonial monarch. He does not hold any political power, but he's supposed to be above politics. But in reality, like all political system, because he's the king and also a sultan, he will have influence behind the scenes.
I think something that I've read is that obviously Mahathir was a very overbearing political figure. And one of the things that I've read that people have accused him of is sort of eroding the traditional power of the sultans and of the king. Is this the case? What sort of relationship did he have with the king or kings that he was dealing with when he was prime minister?
So in general, my take is that Mahathir doesn't really believe in the monarchy, at least not in the Malaysian context. He always had difficulties with the monarchy because this fits into this idea that the reason why the Malay community is so feudalistic is because of this king system, if you want to call it that. You know, right? If you have a king, then you have titles, you have different ruling classes, people born into different classes, all that sort of thing. So Mahathir did not really believe in all that. The reason why people said that he had a very bad relationship with royalty was because during the time when he was in power, back in the early 1990s, one of the sultans who became king was involved in an incident where the sultan actually killed somebody else. Now, obviously, with something as sensitive as that, the police was trying to hush it up. Everyone was trying to hush it up. But Mahathir felt that this thing should not be hushed up. So what happened was that he brought a new law into Malaysia, which says that the king is no longer 100% immune from all the normal laws, and that the king can be charged for crimes, especially if it occurs when he's not performing his official duties. So that really sealed, this bad relationship with certain sultans. So even today, right, the descendants of the Sultan of Johor, the law was specifically targeted at the Sultan of Johor, right? Even today, they still have very bad relationship with the Mahathir family. But among the Malay intelligentsia, a lot of people agree with Mahathir that, the way the sultans behave in Malaysia, that they really should be more control on their activities rather than less.
There were some big figures in the region the wider Southeast Asian region at this time. You've got Suharto in Indonesia, you've got Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Deng Xiaoping in China. What was Mahathir's relationship with the wider region? What was his foreign policy like?
So in terms of his foreign policy, basically Mahathir saw himself as two things. He saw himself as a leader in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but he also saw himself as sort of an unofficial spokesperson for the third world, especially the Islamic world. So that's the reason why he criticized the West a lot, especially what he termed Western hypocrisy, especially on the issue of Palestine. So he spent a lot of time on that issue. He also spent a lot of time, again, trying to change the Malay mindset by launching his most famous foreign policy, and that policy is called the Look East policy. He was asking the Malay population in Malaysia to follow the work ethic of the Japanese, being very industrious, all that sort of stuff. So that was his foreign policy. In terms of his relationship with the rest of Southeast Asia, with his contemporaries, I think he did not have very good relations with Lee Kuan Yew. Mahathir always thought that Tunku Abdul Rahman made a mistake in allowing Singapore to leave the Federation of Malaysia. The argument is that Tunku Abdul Rahman could have said no and put in the security forces to deal with Lee Kuan Yew, and that would be the end of it. And he also saw Lee Kuan Yew as a rival. He was always unhappy that Lee Kuan Yew, because of the economic success of Singapore, was sort of sending a signal out that, we not only can we survive for our own, if we have stayed in Malaysia, we will not be successful. That sort of attitude. Now, in terms of his relationship with other strongmen in Southeast Asia, my take is that it was just a normal relations. But I think he also felt that he was never taken as seriously compared to people like Suharto or Lee Kuan Yew. I think I put it this way, he was really bothered that the Western press, the major Western press, did not give him more press coverage compared to people like Suharto and Lee Kuan Yew.
Was that the case?
Yes, because I was told many times when I interview people who work with him that on the specific visit to America, his visit was not covered on the front page of the New York Times. When Lee Kuan Yew or Suharto goes to America, they're likely to appear on the front page of New York Times. So things like that really bothered him.
If we think about his longevity, he was Prime Minister for a very long time. He won, I think, 5 elections. Obviously, part of the way he did this was sort of locking in the Malay vote and a large part of the Islamist vote into his sort of voting coalition. And they formed a sort of natural majority that would allow him to be basically perpetually keep getting elected. But was there sort of active suppression of other other political forces within the country?
Yes, well, Mahathir doesn't really believe in democracy. He believes that for a country like Malaysia, where there's more or less permanent ethnic tensions between the Malays and the non-Malays, that you need strongman group. At the end of the day, you can't have democracy because if everybody's asking for their rights, everybody's pushing for their rights, you will not have a stable political system. Especially in the background of the ethnic riots, I think what everyone fears, both the Malays and the non-Malays in Malaysia, they fear a repeat of 1969, racial riots. So I think he strongly believes that you can have democracy, but you can have sort of a Malaysian type democracy, very similar to what the Chinese are saying, Chinese type democracy or Chinese type capitalism. So he believes that for a country like Malaysia, you need strongman politics. So in that sense, he doesn't believe in democracy. So the most controversial thing that happened during his term was in 1987. He sort of unleashed the police against the opposition. A lot of opposition people were arrested, put in jail, all that sort of thing. And that was the time when he was under pressure because there was a faction in UMNO who came very close in deposing him as the leader of UMNO. So within a short period after that, you had a thing called Operation Lanang in 1987, where he shut down newspapers, a great many opposition leaders were arrested. That to me is really a confirmation of what I said earlier, that he really believes in strongman rule. He believes that for a ethnically divided society like Malaysia, if you don't have a strong man at the center or you don't have a strong government, everything will fall apart.
He left office in 2003. Very much like Lee Kuan Yew, he sort of became a bit of a backseat driver for the people that succeeded him, even for the successors that he'd handpicked. How long did it take for him to start criticising the people that came after him?
So basically, the prime minister that came after him was a guy called Abdullah Badawi. He chose Abdullah Badawi because he knew Abdullah Badawi was quite a weak figure, interestingly enough. Part of the reason he chose him was that Badawi made it very clear that he'll carry or follow through Mahathir's existing policies. But what he did not know was that once Badawi became the prime minister, he changed completely. He dumped most of Mahathir's key policies. So I have to be careful who you appoint in. So anyway, but basically he was very unhappy when Badawi started, dumping his policy. So within a period about 3 or 4 years, he started criticizing Badawi extensively. And in fact, he campaigned against Badawi. So that's the reason why in Badawi's re-election, second election, Badawi did badly. And he was also the one behind the scenes to appoint the next successor, which is Najib Razak, another very controversial figure in Malaysia. And with Najib Razak, within a period of probably even shorter, within 1 or 2 years after Najib's victory, he began to criticize Najib. I think the problem with all these strongmen of Southeast Asia is that the moment they're out in power, they do not want to run the country day to day, but they still want the main thrust of the policy to be continued. And whoever comes in after them, if you don't carry through their key policies, I think that's where the trouble starts.
Well, and trouble did start in this case, obviously, because Mahathir ends up coming back. There was a big corruption scandal in Malaysia in 2017. Can you talk about how Mahathir came back into politics? I mean, he became prime minister again in 2018. Surely people must have seen this for the disaster that it was going to be. I don't want to sound ageist, but a 93-year-old man who's already been prime minister for 22 years coming back.
Yes. So I think the election of 2018, when we saw Mahathir coming back to power, that was quite a unique election. I don't think it can be repeated. The reason I said that was because back in 2015, that was the start of this 1MDB political corruption. So the background to this is basically that one of the prime minister that he helped choose, Najib Razak, was involved in a gigantic financial scam called 1MDB. The short version of the story is that basically they scammed the Malaysian system out of approximately 4.5 to 6 billion US dollars. I think there's going to be a movie made about this. So basically, Mahathir came back and decided to lead the opposition, and they overthrew his old party, UMNO, by playing this corruption card. Basically, his argument was that Najib's corruption was so huge that it not only embarrassed the Malay race, but it embarrassed the whole country in the eyes of the world. And that this corruption was, in the Malaysian parliament, it was too much. People always understood that there's corruption in Malaysia, but this was, beyond anybody's imagination. So he came back in power in 2018, primarily because of that.
He was there for another 2 years, and then the sort of crisis engulfed his government, and he was eventually pushed out at the age of 95. Can you go into the nature of that crisis? What happened?
Sure. The short version is quite simple. So basically, when he came back in 2018, he led a new opposition alliance against his old party, and the opposition alliance, interestingly, consists of those parties who were opposing him when he was in power. In other words, on the other side, he basically went to the other side, cobbled them together, created an alliance called Pakatan Harapan, or the Alliance of Hope. They won power, they came in. He became the prime minister. But unfortunately, the problem is that he was still trying to run his old style of government. He was trying to run Mahathir government 2.0 rather than a reformist government. People voted them in to change the system. So basically, the system fell apart because there was too much tensions in the system between the whole cabinet was dysfunctional because you had people from the reform movement who wanted to reform Malaysia and a prime minister who was not in favor of reforming the government. He was basically trying to run Mahathir 2.0, a continuation of his government.
UMNO, up until 2018, UMNO had been in power basically for the entirety of Malaysia's existence. It was Tunku's party. It was then Mahathir's party and his successor's party as well. And then Mahathir came back and defeated it. Since Mahathir has left, has the fact that he managed to sort of bulldoze this, sort of lumbering party of UMNO out of the way, do you think has that had any benefit? Has that sort of broken the political system up a bit and made it a bit more open, a bit more reformist?
I think he has in an indirect way. So basically, what happened was after the fall of Mahathir 2.0 in 2020, the new government that came to power did not last. 1 year later, in 2021, which is last year, that coalition also fell apart, and we had a new prime minister now. So we had basically 3 change of government since 2018. So I think that's a good thing because prior to the first regime change in 2018, the general consensus among the ordinary people was that if you had a change of government and UMNO was no longer leading the government, then you might have a situation where racial riots will break out again. So I think that mold has been completely broken. I think people understand that a change of government or change of regime is a normal thing in most places where you're allowed to vote, and that a change of government, in fact, is a very positive thing. So we had 3 change of government since then. There has been no major incidents with any change of government. So I think going forward, I think the Malaysian people will be quite happy to vote in a totally different government from now on. So I think that's the really positive thing about the change brought on by Mahathir in 2018.
Do you think ethnic politics, with this great corruption scandal in 2017, do you think after that ethnic politics has become a little less important in Malaysia?
Not really. I think the problem with Malaysia is that the racial thing is so deeply ingrained in the system. It is sort of institutionalized. So it is not possible for you to remove the racial element from Malaysian politics. The only way to remove it is you need to break down the system completely and rebuild the system from the bottom out. Short of that is very difficult. If you speak to most Malaysians, they will tell you that Malaysian politics is driven by 3 things. It's called the 3R. The first R is race, the second one is religion, and the third one is royalty. So with each of these components, it is very, very difficult to change the system. And I think I mentioned earlier that in the 1980s and 1990s under Mahathir, you have the rise of political Islam. So that's another element on top of the racial divide. So increasingly, Malaysia is heading towards some sort of crisis. It will not happen soon, but it will come sooner or later.
And what do you think the nature of that crisis will be?
So the nature of the crisis is quite simple. There will be a tipping point when those people who are clamoring for a Malaysian Islamic state, eventually there will be a point where either the Islamists win or they lose completely. So Malaysia over the next few years will have a very interesting choice. Either they support a government which brings in more and more Islamic policies, or they move to a system where they will introduce less and less religion in the system. Right now, it looks like we're heading towards a situation where they want more religion in the system, but we don't know because we've seen experiences with other countries like Algeria, Tunisia, all of them. After having an Islamic style of government, the population there decided to revolt, and they changed the system there completely. So we have to see. Malaysia is unique in the sense that among all the Islamic countries, Malaysia in Southeast Asia is the only one where the Malay religion is decided in the constitution. If you read the Malaysian constitution, it says that if you're defined by the state as a Malay person, your religion is Islam. There's actually nowhere constitutionally or legally in Malaysia for a Malay person to leave the Islamic religion. So that part is quite interesting.
Well, that doesn't bode well.
No, it doesn't.
I want to finish by comparing Mahathir to Lee Kuan Yew a little. Obviously, Malaysia and Singapore aren't the only countries that have had these people clinging on to power sort of decade after decade. But this kind of extreme deference to sort of narrow people, letting them come back and be backseat drivers and stuff. What do you think it is about Malaysia and Singapore that caused it to happen in these two countries that many people would argue are sort of the same place, really? There's always there's strong cultural crossover between the two. It's interesting that these two countries had quite similar rulers in some ways, that they both outstayed their welcome. I mean, I suppose it could just be an extreme respect and deference to the old in your culture, for instance. What do you think it is?
Well, I have to disagree with you slightly. I think if you look at it in detail, Malaysia and Singapore are very, very different countries. I'll argue that after 1965, when Singapore left Malaysia, they pursue a totally different set of policies. So they set their policy basically based on meritocracy rather than race. In Malaysia, everything is dependent on ethnicity. So I think that's where things are different. But in terms of the leadership thing, I'll argue that what has happened to Malaysia and Singapore is that basically bloodlines in Southeast Asia is still very important. So, for example, the recent example is you look at Marcos. The first Marcos did such a terrible job in the Philippines that he was actually forced to flee the country. The Americans were forced to use a helicopter to fly him to Hawaii from Manila. And yet, 20 years later, 30 years later, the son has come back and won the presidential election in the Philippines with a huge margin, more than double the votes of his opponent. So I think one of the unusual things about Southeast Asia is that it is still very feudalistic. People still believe in this idea of bloodlines. In other words, if you come from the right political bloodline, you have sort of the right to rule, or people will vote for you simply because of which family you're coming from. And I think that sort of thing is still a big problem in Southeast Asia, especially in traditional societies like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines.
Something that's become more common since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the internet has been that dictators have become much savvier in the way that they centralize power around them. They're still unrelenting in doing that, but they don't use the kind of Stalinist tactics of extreme totalitarianism, a very, very repressive police state. North Korea, for instance, now looks like something of an outlier in the way that it administers its state, whereas in the Cold War era it was very common. Lee Morgenbesser, the political scientist, has called this sophisticated authoritarianism. These people, they use the internet very savvily. They're often actually elected. Putin is elected, for instance. In that sense, do you think Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew were kind of ahead of their time?
Look, my argument is that it's not that they're any more sophisticated compared to the previous generation. Every generation uses their existing tools in order to shape public opinion. So, the previous generation could not have shaped the public opinion we do today through social media, because social media did not exist during that time. I think the key difference between the older generation and this generation in terms of political leadership is that the older generation, the number of voices in the political arena were a lot less. In today's generation, anybody can put their voice out in the public sphere, and it's much harder to manage public opinion today. So that's the reason why they spend a lot of money, a lot of resources, trying to shape public opinion through social media. So it's a question of using the tools. I think the other key difference is that, especially in the last 20 years, since the fall of the Soviet Union, certainly this idea that liberal democracy is the only way out, elections is the only legitimate way governments can be formed. I think these sort of norms are stronger and stronger, and that's the reason why you see authoritarian governments, no matter how rigid the system is, the leader will go through a process of some sort of elections to gain legitimacy. So one of the interesting things you find around the world is that with leaders who has a long history of authoritarian rule, in the last 10, 15 years, they've been holding elections regularly where they win by 70 or 80% of the votes. And obviously, you know that it's not done in a free and fair environment, but they still go through it. They spend a lot of resources, and they tell the rest of the world, "See, I'm a popularly elected leader." So I think it is about the cultural norms of specific time points in history, rather than anything else.
Do you think it actually works for them? Do you think that obviously in reality it doesn't give them much more legitimacy? But do you think that perhaps do you think in a sense that it does? Do you think this is a successful tool?
I think it's successful because they believe in it. And also in the international arena, I think you have some certain bragging rights. You can say that I went through an election, I won election. Yes, it is true that it was not free and fair elections, but I did give my people a chance to vote me out. It's just too bad that the opposition couldn't get act together and I won by 80% of votes. So they did get a bit of legitimacy in the international arena, but you are right. Usually in their own countries, nobody believes in those elections.
James, thank you very much. That was great. If people want to read what you write about Malaysia and about other things, where can they find you?
They can find me on Academia, a website, or ResearchGate, another website. I put all my publications there. So anybody can download any of the articles I write for free.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you never miss new content.